that there are many good, productive, positive provisions of the Law of the Sea Treaty. I strongly support the same provisions the United States Navy supports and that personnel and admirals from the Navy have testified in favor of. That's really not the issue. The issue is the treaty as a whole and all of the provisions taken together, and whether we should pass the treaty as a whole, because we have no choice but to consider the whole, not simply one provision or the other. This treaty has been around for many years, in fact decades. It was negotiated decades ago, and President Reagan, during his administration, I think very correctly rejected the treaty as it stood then. Because of that bold rejection, negotiators went back to the bargaining table and they changed some significant aspects of the treaty. Now, those were improvements, but they don't in any way affect the main concerns I have about the Law of the Sea Treaty, and that is a fundamental baseline threat that the United States would be ceding our autonomy, our control over our own future to other international organizations that often don't have our best interests in mind. And so, Mr. President, that is my fundamental concern. The renegotiation doesn't change that in any way. The testimony of the Navy doesn't even touch on that because it's about other provisions of the treaty. But my main concern with the Law of the Sea Treaty is that the U.S. cedes autonomy to binding international tribunals, gives up American prerogatives, U.S. power, to binding international tribunals, which in the current international context, I do not think would often have our best interests in mind. Now, why do I say that, Mr. President? Well, it's very important to look at the specific provisions of the treaty. We've been debating this and discussing this in the Foreign Relations Committee. We've had numerous so-called expert witnesses. I'm constantly shocked about how many participants in this discussion, quite frankly, including many expert witnesses, clearly haven't read all the significant and important provisions of the treaty. One of the most important provisions of the treaty has to do with these arbitrable tribunals, these courts, if you will, that would have binding authority over all treaty participants, including the United States, if the United States were to become a full treaty participant. So in other words, when disputes arise under the treaty, how do you resolve the dispute? You go to court, and that court, if you will, that special tribunal, has binding authority over the parties to the dispute. There are different sorts of these tribunals. One sort is called a special arbitral tribunal. And under that, under Annex 8, the U.S. again cedes binding authority to these special tribunals in disputes about fisheries, the marine environment, marine scientific research, and navigation. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, I think what's wrong with it, or at least the threat it poses to the United States, becomes clear when you look at the nature of this tribunal. It's a 5-person body and simple majority rules. Now, who appoints the people? Well, both parties to a dispute pick 2 panelists. So if we were brought into court, if you will, by another country, that other country, opposing our views, opposing our interests, would pick 2 panelists, and we would pick 2 panelists. What about the 5th panelist? Obviously important, because it could well be the tie-breaking vote. Well, under the treaty, the parties are supposed to try to agree on that 5th panelist. But if the parties can't agree, and of course that's a distinct possibility, and the party taking us into court, the other country, could just flat out refuse to agree with any of our suggestions and choices, no matter how reasonable, then what happens? Well, then the UN Secretary General picks the 5th panelist. He picks the tie-breaking vote. I'll be very honest with you, Mr. President, Senators, I don't feel comfortable with that. In the current international context, when we have been opposed so often at the UN, when countries gang up on us, quite frankly, so often in forums like the UN, I don't feel comfortable with the Secretary General of the UN picking the tiebreaker and essentially determining our fate. There are other types of tribunals under the law of the sea treaty. The next type is simply called a general arbitral tribunal. It's under Annex 7 of the treaty. And again, the fundamental issue and the fundamental problem in my mind is that under that annex, under the provisions of the treaty, if the U.S. were to become a full partner in the treaty, the U.S. would cede, again, binding authority to these other sorts of tribunals regarding all other disputes. So in other words, the first type of arbitral tribunal would cover the 4 issue areas that I mentioned a few minutes ago. This general tribunal would cover all other disputes. Now, how is this tribunal made up? Very similar, in fact, to the others. Again, a 5-person body, simple majority rules. Both parties to the dispute, in this case, pick one panelist. So if we were hauled into international court, if you will, by another country, that other country would pick one panelist, and we would pick one panelist. Again, similar to the other tribunal, then both parties together would try to agree on the other 3 panelists. And obviously those 3 would compose a majority of the 5. But if the parties can't agree, and once again, if our opposing country, the country that's hauled us into court, doesn't want to agree to any of our ideas, any of our suggestions, no matter how reasonable, it can just stand firm and not agree. And in that case, those 3 members of the tribunal, a majority of the tribunal, would be chosen by the law of the sea lead bureaucrat, the head of law of the sea land under the treaty, an international bureaucrat similar in background and attitudes in many instances to the Secretary General of the UN. Again, same fundamental problem in my mind, that we're ceding our autonomy, we're ceding binding decisions that can be very significant in terms of our fate, our interests, our values, to this international court dominated by, controlled by, potentially, international bureaucrats. Now, why is this a threat? What sort of disputes could arise that could go to these